All right, here we go with section 6, and here is the focus question. Despite women achieving the vote, women's economic rights were sorely limited in the early 1960s as women were often slotted into low-wage retail positions, had limited access to higher education, and lacked legal control over their earnings in a marriage. Concerned that the nation was wasting its woman power, Kennedy established the President's Commission on the Status of Women in 1961. Leaders of the commission, such as Eleanor Roosevelt, found widespread discrimination against women in the workplace. In 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, which barred sex discrimination against those holding the same jobs. A year later, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act included a clause that banned discrimination on account of sex. These changes contributed to the birth of a new wave of feminism in the 1960s. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, struck a powerful chord for many dissatisfied women. In it, Friedan criticized the emptiness of consumer culture and emphasized middle-class discontent. Her book portrayed talented and educated women trapped in a world in which they believed marriage, motherhood, and family were their primary ambitions. Women's lives still revolved around the now suburban home, which Friedan called a comfortable concentration camp. Though the 1964 Civil Rights Act had provided a powerful tool to break down sex discrimination, women's rights activists argued that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission did not take its implications seriously. Consequently, in 1966, women's rights leaders formed the National Organization for Women, or NOW, with Friedan as president. As a civil rights organization, NOW pressed for equal opportunity in jobs, education, and political participation. A different kind of feminist movement emerged from the civil rights and student movements. Young women who embraced ideologies of equality and freedom and learned political organizing skills, once facing inequality and sexual exploitation within these movements, formed their own. Some white women in civil rights work drew parallels between the treatment of blacks and women. In SDS, women protested their subordination and exploitation by male activists. By 1967, women were forming consciousness-raising groups to discuss the cause of their discontent. The movement began sensationally at the Miss America beauty pageant in Atlantic City in 1968, where women threw into a trash can, but did not burn, bras, high-heeled shoes, and copies of Playboy and Cosmopolitan. The women's liberation movement greatly expanded the idea of freedom by insisting that it should be applied to the most personal and intimate parts of life. These feminists, introducing terms like sexism, sexual politics, and the phrase "the personal is political," argued that sexual relations, marriage, and beauty standards were just as political as war, civil rights, and class tensions. They repudiated the sacred nuclear family of the 1950s and permanently changed Americans' definition of freedom. Radical feminists first campaigned for the repeal of state laws that denied women the right to terminate a pregnancy. They defined control over reproduction as the most basic of women's freedoms. But women's liberation's concerns went far beyond sexual freedom. Interests ranged from combating domestic violence to inequalities in the law, churches, workplaces, and family. By 1970, feminist ideals were penetrating mainstream American life. Perhaps the greatest surprise of the 1960s was the movement for gay liberation. Gays and lesbians had formed societies in the 1950s, but these were not protest groups. Homosexuals faced stigmatization as sinful or mentally ill. Most states made homosexual acts illegal, and police harassed gays in major cities like San Francisco and New York. Most gays and lesbians kept their sexuality in the closet. The 1960s transformed gay politics. One moment in particular marks the beginning of gay liberation: the 1969 riot caused by a police raid on the Stonewall Inn in New York's Greenwich Village. Instead of complying with police as usual, gays fought back. In a few years, gay pride marches were being held in cities across the country. In the mid-1960s, a new movement emerged among Mexican Americans that challenged their status as second-class citizens. Like Black Power, this movement emphasized pride in the Mexican past and the Chicano culture born in the United States. But unlike SDS and Black Power, Latino activism was tied to labor struggles. In 1965, Cesar Chavez, the son of migrant farm workers and a disciple of Martin Luther King Jr., led nonviolent protests to force growers to sign labor contracts with the United Farm Workers Union. The UFW campaign mobilized Latinos for civil and economic rights across the Southwest, and by 1970, the major growers had signed contracts with the union. In New York, the Young Lords, modeled on the Black Panthers, held street demonstrations to protest conditions facing Puerto Ricans. Like SDS and SNCC, the Latino movement, with its male leaders and emphasis on machismo, inspired protests by women who called for freedom and equality for all members of La Raza, the race or the people. A new generation of Indian activists also emerged in the 1960s. These activists rejected the moderate protests of previous generations in favor of more confrontational tactics modeled on those used within the civil rights movements. Initially led by the National Indian Youth Council, founded in 1961, the movement demanded not just economic aid, but also self-determination and freedom from police discrimination. Calling for more militant action, one group of Native American youth in Minnesota formed the American Indian Movement, or AIM, which focused on restoring the economic resources guaranteed in historic treaties. AIM's protests included a takeover of Alcatraz Island, seizing the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and occupying Wounded Knee, the site of the massacre of Native Americans by Army troops in 1890. While AIM leaders were often arrested and imprisoned, their activism called national attention to centuries of injustice and contributed to significant change in federal Indian policy during the 1970s. Although the rights revolution began in the streets, it won constitutional legitimacy in the Supreme Court, traditionally the most conservative branch of government. Guided by Chief Justice Earl Warren, the court greatly expanded the rights of all Americans and placed them beyond the reach of legislative and local majorities. The court's move toward protecting civil liberties and rights began in the 1930s, but was signaled in 1957 when the court started to check McCarthyism by overturning the convictions of individuals who had advocated overthrowing the government, had not answered the questions of the House Un-American Activities Committee, or had refused to state their political beliefs to state officials, beginning on June 17th, or Red Monday. By 1969, the court had affirmed the right to hold unpopular views and dismantled the Cold War loyalty security system. In the 1950s and 1960s, civil liberties became integrated with civil rights. The court protected the rights of private organizations to keep secret their membership lists and secured modern freedom of the press. In the 1960s, the court continued to strike down numerous state segregation laws. In Loving versus Virginia, 1967, the court declared unconstitutional state laws that prohibited interracial marriage. The court in 1968 made illegal racial discrimination in the rental or sale of housing. The court also pressed states to respect civil liberties enshrined in the Bill of Rights. It required states to abide by protections against illegal search and seizure, honor defendants' rights to a speedy trial, prohibit cruel and unusual punishments, and secure the right of poor defendants to receive publicly supported counsel. Miranda versus Arizona in 1966 was one of the most important of these decisions, in which individuals were supposed to be made aware of their rights on arrest, including their right to remain silent and confer with a lawyer before answering any questions. The court also ruled to oversee fairness of the democratic process at the state and local level by establishing the principle that districts electing members of state legislatures must be equal in population, in the case Baker versus Carr of 1962. They also moved to solidify the wall between church and state by decreeing that prayers and Bible readings in public schools were unconstitutional, in the case Engel versus Vitale in 1961. The Warren Court also outlined entirely new rights in response to changes in American society. Most dramatically, it invented a constitutional right to privacy in Griswold versus Connecticut, a case from 1965, which overturned a state law banning the use of contraceptives. Although the Constitution nowhere articulates a right to privacy, Justice William O. Douglas, the author of the decision, asserted that privacy was the basis of all other freedoms and that a constitutionally protected area of privacy within marriage could be inferred from the penumbras or the shadows of the Bill of Rights. The court soon made privacy a right of individuals within or outside marriage by ensuring access to birth control, and most controversially by creating a constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy in Roe v. Wade of 1973, a major victory of the feminist movement and the source of major opposition to this day, leading to the overturning of Roe v. Wade during the first Trump administration. The rulings that followed Griswold and Roe seemed to accept the view that families were collections of individuals rather than a unit within a single authority. Women gained multiple rights within the family, including protection against rape and assault by husbands. So that's the end of Section 6. We'll be back for Section 7.